Evening. I'm Wendy Warren, Director of Education at Holocaust Museum Houston. Welcome to the third event of the Dismantling Bias, Anti-Semitism, White Supremacy, and Inequality lecture series presented by HEB. We extend our sincere gratitude to HEB for their generous support in helping the museum host this important series of conversations. Before we begin, please note that the chat has been disabled and we ask that you place your questions in the Q&A link. We will get to as many as possible toward the end of our program. Tonight's event, a conversation with Cole Brown, author of Greyboy, Finding Blackness in a White World, will be moderated by our very own Lori Garcia. Lori Garcia is the Associate Director of Education, Outreach at Holocaust Museum Houston. In this role, Lori manages the Educator in Motion program, a free school program that supports Holocaust education, human rights, and social justice in pre-K through 12th grade classrooms, and assists with the creation of lesson plans and curriculum for educators. She earned her BA in History from Texas A&M University and her MA in Holocaust and Genocide Studies from Stockton University. Prior to joining the museum, she worked in the field of early childhood education as an educator and family advocate. Welcome, Lori.
Great. Thank you so much, Wendy. It's my honor and pleasure to introduce our guest for this evening. Cole Brown was raised in the city of brotherly love and sisterly affection. He is a Philly kid at heart. While spending childhood summers between Ethiopia and the Midwest, Cole matured in Philadelphia's predominantly white private schools and neighborhoods, an experience that delivered an awareness of race and class from a young age. After graduating high school, Cole moved to Washington, D.C. to attend Georgetown University as a finance major. Landmark events such as the death of Michael Brown and the 2016 election caused Cole to rethink his original plans. Cole graduated from Georgetown with a major in justice and peace studies and a passion for storytelling. Grayboy has garnered critical acclaim since its release on September 15, 2020. Cole has recently been interviewed by a variety of media sites, including Houston Matters, and has launched his own Instagram live series called #Life in the Gray, where he interviews well-known people to discuss how they are pushing boundaries or cutting across cultural barriers. Please welcome Cole Brown.
I'm so excited and love the work that the museum is doing and particularly this series in particular. So thank you for having me. I'm excited for this conversation.
Yeah, so again, thank you so much, Cole, for joining us this evening. We're really thrilled to have you and your beautiful work featured in our series, and we're really looking forward to our conversation tonight. So I'd first like to talk a little bit about Grayboy. So Grayboy is a poignant collection of stories, letters, and essays that explore and redefine the meaning of Black identity. Each vignette provides insight into the lived experiences of Black youth living at the intersection of race, class, and gender. It's also a journey of discovery. Grayboy chronicles the journey of finding one's voice and a sense of place and belonging in the world. So I'd like to begin by asking, what inspired you to write Grayboy?
Easiest answer to that is that Grayboy started as an essay for a class. I was at Georgetown, as you mentioned, and I was a junior in an entrepreneurship class where we were meant to write a book about a business we wanted to start. Once I heard the word count, which was about a third the length of what Grayboy ended up becoming, I knew that I needed to write about this instead. I think for the purpose of the assignment, I came up with like a diversity consulting business or something. Beside the point. The point is I knew that I wanted it to be about this. So in a sense, having a professor tell me I had to inspired it. But to get to the core of the question, I think it was more, feeling as though I grew up in Philly, not seeing my story told, either in sort of the lessons that we were learning in school, in my immediate community, or in the broader media landscape, in the books I read, and so forth. So the probably truer answer to that question, what inspired it, is just kind of a lifetime of experiences feeling as though I wasn't seeing myself and wanting to see myself represented.
Mhm. Yeah, well, thank you so much. I mean, I think this is a really important and profound contribution to the literature. So again, I thank you for this beautiful work. So for our audience members that haven't had the opportunity to read your book yet, could you explain the significance and the meaning of the term gray boy that's used in your title?
I can. So if you haven't read the book yet, the book is about, and I think you gave a nice summary of it. It's about growing up Black in white spaces, particularly privileged white spaces, and one's journey towards identity in that space, negotiating those spaces when surrounded by dissimilarity. It's many of my own stories. It's part memoir, but I also interview people as well. So it's many of their stories, people that grew up similarly to me. You asked about the term Grayboy. I debated between several titles. This book took 4 years to write, and I uh, went between in 4 years. I mean, I batted around several. I landed on Grayboy because it comes from a poem by Amiri Baraka. I think it's called "A Letter to Half-White College Students," maybe a poem to half-white college students. And I'll quote it, but I'm paraphrasing. The quote is included in the book as an epigraph, where it says, "Are you sure you are not an imitation Grayboy? Are you sure you are not so full of Richard Burton that Elizabeth Taylor is coming out of your ears?" He's very critical of Black kids like me, Black kids that aren't Black enough. And I liked the idea of reclaiming that term, Grayboy, wearing it almost as a point of pride on the cover of my book.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, that's really profound, and it's really great because you've been kind of like alluding to this already, but I'd like to highlight one central theme that's interwoven throughout your book, which of course is representation. So throughout your book, you discuss the importance of representation. So reflecting on your childhood, you describe how powerful it was to see Blackness represented, but also celebrated in popular culture. So could you talk about the role models, leaders, or figures who have shaped or influenced your life?
I mean, the most important ones are not in popular culture. I think the most important ones in my life, as in many people's lives, I write about in the book are, my mother and my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, my paternal grandfather, people that my mother's side of the family is all Ethiopian, and that was a particular vision of Blackness that was not present largely in Philly. My father's side of the family is African American, Black from the Midwest. That's a totally different kind of being Black that I also didn't see much of in Philly. So I was blessed to have, particularly when young, I still had my grandparents around, and they handed down much of that identity for me. They ensured that representation, and then my parents as well, obviously. When I separate from that, separate from family that had direct influence, when I was young, I was a reader, and some of that was forced. I mean, my parents sort of, and I write about that in the book. My parents forced me to read, a lot of Black literature. So my heroes, even at an early age, were Richard Wright and Langston Hughes, and then I was a huge hip hop fan, still am. So at an early age, it was Missy Elliott and Kanye West. All of them, I think, shaped not just my Black identity, but really who I am, along every other possibly imaginable demographic line.
So kind of like going along with this theme of also the lack of diverse representation in the media, you talk about it developing stereotypes or preconceived notions of what it means to be Black. So in your book, you write, given this introduction to Blackness, your peers were unable to recognize your own Black identity, and your classmates sought ways to reconcile their perceptions of what Blackness was with understanding, but rather than kind of like altering this stereotype, they started to disassociate you away entirely by saying, oh, Cole's not really Black. So if you don't mind, could you elaborate on this experience of questioning one's Blackness as well as finding your identity, particularly in these spaces?
Yeah, so the specific example I'm talking about in that context is Allen Iverson. I actually meant to mention him in the last answer. I grew up in Philly. I grew up in Philly in the early 2000s. Allen Iverson was a god. He was a fantastic basketball player, but he was also a cultural force. He rapped, he was fashionable, all of this stuff. He had tattoos, but it was a certain vision of what Blackness was, that in many ways became, probably embodied, and in some ways is responsible for probably the stereotype that we have. I'm a massive Allen Iverson fan. but I acknowledged from a very early age that I was not that. And I think that so many of my classmates were exposed to that version of Blackness and anticipated that being all that could possibly exist. So the point that I try to make there, and I actually think it's an important one, is that this phrase "not really Black" that I heard frequently. People often, particularly when young, but even today, will throw that around almost flippantly. I think not considering what they're really saying. If you're identifying in me certain positive traits, certain traits that perhaps you see in yourself, the way I speak, the way I eat, the way I dress, things that are inherently superficial, but you see as positive. And then you say, oh, but because of those traits, you're not really Black. Well, what you're then necessarily saying is that the negative traits are the ones that belong within the bounds of Blackness. And that is something that I struggled to negotiate with. And I think that I struggle with it less now, but certainly still hear that term, "not really Black." There's a chapter in the book that is called "Not Really Black" for that reason. In some ways, that's the thesis of the book.
Yeah, thank you so much. So kind of like bringing it to your more like modern day perspective. So as a child that grew up in the 1990s and 2000s, do you feel that we as a society have made greater strides towards representation and diversity in the media, whether it's TV, film, or print? Are we slowly starting to shift away from these monolithic representations of Blackness?
Yeah, I think there's no question about that. There's a whole chapter that was basically on that in the book that I cut like super last minute, like within the last kind of 2 weeks before I turned it in. But it sought to address that question specifically, because I think that absolutely we have. And that's not even really an opinion. I mean, like empirically, it's been shown that yes, we have. If you look at Black showrunners, Black writers, Black characters, particularly on TV these days, there's just such a broader array of options. And in like mainstream, you don't have to go to BET to find them. I mean, like in mainstream media. So I think that that's incredibly encouraging. I think that was in many ways actually ushered in, and due to Obama and in the Obama era, where there was just like a coolness in being all these different kinds of Black. So I'm really encouraged by that. I think it's important to underscore that like media power is not the same as economic power. It's not the same as political power. I mean, so yes, there have been significant gains in that realm, but that is not that that certainly doesn't mean mission accomplished.
Right. Thank you so much. And so I know that we do have some educators and students in the audience. So you also talk about representation in your education. So you movingly reflect upon the following. Yeah. So you write, "From where could we learn about Blackness? Certainly not from our formal education, which tiptoed around our history 11 months of the year, slowing only briefly to play Dr. King's greatest hits during February's 28 short days. Black leaders were seldom discussed in my all-white classroom. If ever, a quintessential part of our identity was missing." So could you speak a little bit more on this experience and this issue?
Yeah, I had actually in that same chapter that I just referenced that I ended up cutting. If I keep referencing it, maybe it should have stayed after all. I write about the 3 Black teachers I've had who didn't subscribe to that theory of teaching. And they stand out because they were in some ways the exception that proved the rule. I mean, there's studies that show the positive impact that having a Black teacher has on Black pupils in particular, in terms of their future stock in life. I felt like I was fortunate because I had 2 parents that forced me to read all of this other stuff. Had the Malcolm X and Black Boy and Native Son and like the canon of Black literature. Had they not, I would not have gotten it almost entirely from my schooling, with the exception of these 3 teachers. And I know that they had a monumental impact because in that formal setting, they were willing to imbue our narratives with a level of import that other teachers apparently didn't think it deserved. Apparently thought it wasn't worth doing. So I think that if you're in a schooling environment that is not feeding you that, it's important to get it elsewhere. If you have the privilege of, having people that hand that down to you.
Mhm. Right. Yeah. I think, like you said, I think it's really important to have representation in schools and staff, teachers, but also really,
Mhm.
advocating for social justice like education and incorporating these narratives into the classroom. So kind of what you alluded to before. So how can we as educators, students, parents, or even community members support and advocate for the inclusion of diverse curriculum that really reflects the
Yeah.
narratives and experiences of students whose history largely goes untold?
I think that's so often Black stories, whether it be history or literature, are so often regarded as somehow like a subculture or like a
Mhm.
subsect, or,
Right,
or perhaps totally divorced from like
right,
American history and American culture.
right.
Like how I make it through an AP US history course, and only talk about Black people, between the years of whatever 1956 and
Right.
1968
Mhm,
is just totally illogical to me.
mhm,
So I think that in so many realms, but particularly when you're talking about the arts, you can't have an honest conversation about American history without talking about Black people.
right.
But perhaps I shouldn't have even said particularly about the arts, because like you can't talk about the economic history of the United States without talking about the institution of slavery and how that was the foundation of our
Mhm,
economic power. You can't talk about the military history. I mean, like all of these realms. I think if you are an educator that is having any of these conversations and somehow managing to do so without bringing up the contributions of Black people, um, frankly, I don't think you're doing your job. Like
mhm.
I think you're feeding a version of history that is at its base untrue, and not as complete as it should be.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you so much. Just providing a narrative that's really like complete and incorporates all of these different like elements and aspects. So again, thank you so
Mhm.
much for your very poignant words. So next, I'd like to talk about another central theme that's in your book, which is about the perception of Blackness, particularly in white spaces.
Mhm.
And so again, you talked about this earlier, but essentially because labels and stereotypes have been affixed to Blackness, and individuals' behaviors or actions are seen and are judged through this lens. So you write a story, you interview your friend Amira, and she recalls that
Mhm.
she was constantly labeled as having an attitude. So you write that this
Yes.
whispered indictment really forces her to grapple with how her actions are perceived and how her hallmark confidence and strength are always going to be judged through this prism of her Blackness. So going along with those lines, you also talk about the need to develop, learn, but also refine survival strategies when navigating these predominantly white spaces. So you and your peers at your interview, you talk about this idea of code switching, the dilemma of having to pick your battles or taking on an it's not worth it kind of attitude, as well as suppressing the urge to make a splash to maintain the tranquility of the pond. So for our audience members that may be unfamiliar with the term code switching, could you kind of explain this a little bit more and speak to these survival strategies?
Yeah. So code switching is typically, I think that it takes perhaps a slightly different definition in the context of this conversation. But code switching is typically refers to, I am firmly from culture A, and I, for whatever reason, have to enter culture B. It's usually in the context of sort of like I am from a Black culture and I have to enter the corporate world or something. And in order to gain acceptance in culture B, I have to leave behind many of the cultural markers that would have enabled me to gain acceptance in culture A. I have to, speak differently. I have to eat differently. I have to, appear less confident in some ways in culture B just to be accepted, because my behavior wouldn't have otherwise been. I think that it's interesting in this context though, because the what I'm talking about is Black kids growing up in white spaces, and therefore you're not code switching in the same way, because like
Mhm.
learning how to behave in white spaces, I now, or until very recently, worked a corporate job, and that was not a new lesson for me, right? Because because I grew up in spaces where that sort of behavior would have become second nature. Interestingly, when I talk about the black table, which there's a chapter called the black table, and I write about it's a table where all the black kids sat in the lunchroom, and interestingly, almost there was more of a code switching that had to occur. I needed to adopt the language. I needed to learn the lines of behavior there, in order to gain acceptance there. Interestingly, I think that as I have grown older, though, that has switched a bit. I do feel, and I think most people feel, comfortable where they are in the majority. And I know the behavioral expectations in those realms. And there is an element of, particularly in corporate life, stepping into that world and feeling as though I'm not quite bringing my whole self with me.
Mhm. Yeah, great. Thank you so much. So you have a really beautiful chapter that talks about the talk. So the talk you explain is a
Yes.
set of rules, an instruction manual. You describe it as tips on how to
Yeah.
best not be converted to the past tense when interacting with figures of authority. So you also ask, why do our parents uniformly instruct these constraints on us as opposed to the white counterparts? And so you really beautifully
Yeah.
write, simply put, the stakes were higher for us. The threat of violence was real, such is the burden of Blackness. So it's just a really, really beautiful, but also heartbreaking kind of like thing to think about. So could you discuss the talk, this rule book, and how it speaks to the disparities in our society today?
I can. I write about. I think that was written largely in the context of parenting. I write about my mother, having to have that talk with me. I think that when there's so many examples these days of police violence and Black death at the hands of police, and I think that when we see a headline, if you don't experience this personally, you often don't realize just the personal impact that headline has. So I wrote about this in the context of Trayvon Martin was killed when I was a high schooler. I think I was 10th grade maybe. And that had personal implications. Like, it wasn't just a headline on CNN, like I was no longer allowed to wear black hoodies, because Trayvon Martin was killed wearing a black hoodie. And everyone knows, logically, that were he not to be wearing a black hoodie, that probably would not have changed his fate. And yet you got to do what you can to cope, even for your own sanity, because the belief that this is inevitable, that it wasn't the hoodie, it is just sort of his personhood, that is a truth that is almost too difficult to bear. So I'm losing sight of the question. I think that came at a time when I had just sort of grown up physically. I had hit a growth spurt recently, and I was just over 6 feet tall for the first time in my life. That terrified my mother. The idea that the world would, for the first time in my life, see me as a Black man rather than a Black boy. I think that there was a threat, as I say, of physical bodily harm that really terrified her. But also in the context that I was in, there was a threat that is not one of bodily harm, but just of like, that is almost administrative in nature. There's a threat of like, you need to be respectful to all the elders that you meet, Black, white, or otherwise, because some of these white people won't give you the benefit of the doubt. And if you're not overly respectful, if you don't say Mr. and Mrs. every time you can, it could turn out that one of these people is the dean at X school that you want to go to, or is the CEO at X job that you want to apply to. And when they're not giving you the benefit of the doubt, you need to work twice as hard to make sure that you leave them with the impression that you are respectable. I mean, these are respectability politics. That's a burden that I don't think my white peers had placed upon them.
Right. And as you mentioned earlier, within the talk, you really illuminate the experiences and the perspective of Black parents as they're navigating these really difficult conversations and all of the emotions that kind of get wrapped up in it. Your mother also writes a beautiful letter reflecting on her hopes and dreams for your future, along with her fears and anxieties. So looking back as an adult, how has your perspective of parenthood changed or shifted?
That's a good question. How's my I think that I write about parenting a few different ways. I write about my grandfather. Obviously, there's a letter from my mother, but I also write about this organization called Jack and Jill.
Mhm.
And Jack and Jill is a mother's group that was explicitly established to bring together Black kids that don't grow up around other Black kids. It was founded in Philadelphia in the early 20th century, and I think I am just more empathetic to all those mothers today than I probably was certainly when I started writing this 4 years ago, but probably even earlier. Um, and my mother in particular, um, because I just have a newfound appreciation for just how hard it must be to, particularly for my mom, like to be trying to raise a Black son when the news that we're seeing. I mean, I really feel for the Black mothers today, like the Black parents that had to parent through this summer of violence. Because I don't know what you say. Like I don't, when these videos are being shared on social media and your children will see them, whether you, ordain that to be so or not. Um, I don't know what you say to a young Black boy. Like I remember how I felt when Trayvon was killed. I don't know what you say to a 13-year-old Black boy that that watches that video that I watched. Um, so I think that how has it changed my perspective? Only that I think I'm just more empathetic at this point.
Mhm.
I'm not sure I've come down on any hard and fast conclusions, frankly. Hopefully I have a couple years before that becomes an issue. But I'm empathetic to that predicament. More so than I would have been years ago.
Mhm. Right. Yeah. Thank you so much. I mean, it's a truly heartbreaking issue to see how Black bodies
Yeah.
are kind of like destroyed, and how a lot of this is really increasing in our environment. But since we were talking about Black women, you also examine beauty in your book, particularly in relation to Black women. So you talk about how there's a sort of standard of beauty that's strictly defined, essentially society seeing whiteness as the norm, but also as the epitome of beauty. So in one of your essays, it's kind of like a letter format. You write to a friend of yours, and you write that, I've watched them devalue and undervalue your beauty, label you as undesirable, and treat it as a foregone conclusion, but you weren't the only one. They did it to many over the years. It's hard out here for a Black girl, harder still for a Black girl in a white world. So how did you approach this essay on the beauty of Black women?
That essay was really important to me. It was as you mentioned, it's a letter to a girl that, like, it's probably even overstating the case to call her a friend. She was a girl that it is a specific girl that was kind of I was the Black kid at the all boys school in the white crew, and at the all girls school across the street there was a Black girl in the crew, right? And as our crews began to come together, um, there was all these assumptions that, like, our love story was, preordained, and we're just gonna the two of us are gonna ride off into the sunset together, for no reason other than the fact that we were the two Black people in this scenario. Like, we didn't even really know each other.
Mhm.
And I remember, in the midst of just like preteen crap, like, not even bullying is probably too strong a word, just like teasing. My reaction was to really, distance myself from her, to um to denigrate her in the way that they were. I mean, to say, I would never, kind of thing. Really just as an impulsive reaction to their jokes. But as I thought about it when I got older, and particularly as I saw my sister go through that same system, I realized just how damaging that could be. And how and just the import of standing in solidarity with a girl that must be struggling with those issues. So I wrote that letter pretty late in the process. Like I mentioned, it was 4 years, and I don't think that it came in until maybe year 3. Um, but I was trying to get at. I wanted to tell this narrative of tokens, both in Black men and Black women, Black boys and Black girls. But I didn't really know how to tell that part of it. That just seems so diametrically opposed that I didn't know how to tell that part of it authentically sort of her perspective or a Black woman's perspective. So the best I could do was get at it as sort of like, this is my letter to you. And I tried hard to both be honest about where I stood then and some of my missteps, but then be honest about where I stand now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. Thank you so much. So towards the end of your book, you pen a very haunting essay titled The Reveal. So you basically, through this chapter, examine the disillusionment and the painful realization that, as you say, discrimination does not discriminate. It's almost as if the illusion of your own equality was like a veil that's been lifted. So you describe using the term the reveal as a reference to Du Bois' writings and description of his own revelation. So could you talk a little bit about how the terms the reveal and the revelation fit within a broader historical, but also a contemporary context?
Yeah, so in some ways there's nothing new there. In most ways there's nothing new there. I mean, Du Bois writes about the veil and the veil that separates him from the white world and sort of a parsed reality where Black people are just walking through the world differently and experiencing and inhabiting in these same spaces entirely differently. So as I mentioned in The Souls of Black Folk, he writes about his revelation, and he talks about Du Bois was a token in many ways. I mean, he grew up in mixed race schools and he was the first person to get a PhD from Harvard, and he lived this life that was not sort of what was the Black narrative at the time, as was widely understood. And he writes about this revelation where something really mundane. He gives a girl a Valentine and she rejects it preemptively, and how he realized that even at a young age that meant that they see him differently. And as I mentioned, this isn't just a memoir. I interviewed people, and after accumulating these interviews, I tried to find the strands that were consistent through all of our experiences, because I figured that was the best way to get at kind of a cohesive token experience. And time and time again, people would talk to me about like this single moment, when it just like the ugliness of bigotry, the ugliness of racism. It is no longer about sort of I am just different because I'm a different color. It now has some bite to it, and everyone I talk to remembers that moment. And I just needed language to get at that moment. So I end up calling it The Reveal because Du Bois talks about the revelation, but also because like in film, we talk about the reveal when Darth Vader says, Luke, I am your father. That's like, you got to rethink everything you thought you knew about this story, right? And that's how I chose to get at it. So I write about my own as it happened on a soccer field and being spat at and called the N-word, and it was just ugly. But then also some more mundane examples to try to make the case that it doesn't have to be, this aggressive, ugly, abusive thing. It can be something pretty simple where all of a sudden you realize how you are seen.
Right. Yeah, and then the next chapter is also a very poignant. You title it I believe it was The Greater Reveal.
Yeah.
In this one, it talks about the turbulent times that we're living in. So as many of us know, over the past few years, we've seen the rise of hate crimes and the proliferation of hate speech and rhetoric that targets marginalized communities. However, in the midst of these times, we've also started to see a shift. I think more and more people are acknowledging the existence and the continuation of white supremacy, are learning about the ways in which systematic racism permeates institutions, but also society today, and are starting to embrace anti-racism work by engaging in activism to combat injustice. So does this give you reason to be hopeful? Do you think that we're moving away from indifference and towards change?
Hope's a funny thing. I just wrote a piece in the city. I'm calling to you from Australia. I'm not even sure we covered that, but I'm in Sydney. And I just wrote a piece for the Sydney Morning Herald that was like the least hopeful thing ever, and I got a lot of backlash for it. I think hope's a hard thing to come by these days. I felt differently probably a week ago even than I do now. But I don't look at the work of the last 4 years or even the work of the last 1 week and say that the march towards progress is an inevitable one. I think that the ugliness that we've seen unmasked in and emboldened in these last 4 years isn't going anywhere. you know, kind of in the short and medium term. I don't see sort of a return to normal that everybody hopes for. And I also question the premise of like, you know, is that normal one that was equitable? So in kind of the short and medium term, you know, loosely defined, not really. I think we have a lot of healing to do, frankly. Like I think we got a couple of ugly years ahead, as we've had a couple of ugly years behind us. Hopefully a more stable, difficult years, but still difficult. In the slightly longer term, I do think that there's some cause for hope. I mean, like when I saw, you know, when I saw from a very long way away the marches and protests over what was the American summer these past several months, I saw a broad swath of cultures of the U.S. populace in that crowd. We marched in Sydney, Australia. I was like the only Black person in the crowd. Like I saw allyship that was not performative, but was really pressing truth to power. And in a slightly longer time horizon, that gives me reason for hope.
Wonderful. Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah. So really kind of like confronting our history and kind of like continuing that work, making sure that like the progress, you know, moves forward. So again, thank you so much. Could you talk a little bit about your writing process? I know you mentioned that it took about 4 years to write the book. So how did you approach it? And I know that we do have some young students in the audience. So what advice would you give to aspiring young writers?
Yeah. That's fun. So the writing process was in many ways a brutal one, and probably an incredibly inefficient one in retrospect. As I mentioned, I started this as an essay. I remember the word count was 20,000 words, which for reference is about a third of where the book ended up. And at that point, it was like, just put pen to paper because you need to get some words out, without any real sense of a broader narrative of language. I mean, just like, it was just like, get words on paper. I think that's helpful because there's so much hesitation around this undertaking of a longer writing work that sometimes you need someone to just say, sit your butt down and write. But the issue was then I had a lot of, I didn't know what I sounded like as a writer yet. So I built up a lot of like legacy language that over the years, as I began to know what I sounded like, which took me like 2.5 years. I then had to like grapple with this stuff that you know was from a couple years before and just didn't quite sound like me anymore. So the process took a long time because I had a lot of writing that I then had to figure out what my narrative was. How do I show development over the course of this book? And also, as I was writing, new things would happen. So, you know, there is a chapter that reflects on Trump's election, and obviously that can't be written until he's elected. There's a couple examples like that I'm kind of writing in real time, that were important contributions, but just needed time to play out. In terms of my advice to young writers, I get asked this these days, which is funny because I am myself a young writer. The advice is really just, this is simple, but just like sit down and write. I think James Baldwin was once asked this question and by the Paris Review, and he said exactly that. Write. There's nothing else to say. Find a way to keep alive and write. That's the only way to figure it out. There's not much else. Oh, and read. I guess that's my part 2. Read, and read really good writers, and steal from them. And you'll figure it out along the way.
Great, thank you. Do you have any top 3 recommendations?
Man, yes. So I read a lot of Black writing, which should not be surprising at this point. Books that have like changed my life. Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. I read that, and actually in the context of this Dismantling Bias lecture series, it makes a lot of sense. I read that as a college sophomore, and it truly changed my life. I read The Nickel Boys last year by Colson Whitehead. I think that he is a national treasure. If you haven't read The Nickel Boys, it is remarkable.
Yes.
Yeah, it's so good. One of my favorite books is Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. That's more of a history book. If there are educator, or not, I'm sorry, I said Caste and I didn't mean it. That's her new one. I do like that book. But The Warmth of Other Suns, her first one, is a masterpiece. If you are an educator, particularly if you're a history educator, The Warmth of Other Suns is a worthwhile endeavor.
Great, thank you. So yes, I hope our audience will check out those really beautiful writings. Also for the young adults in our audience, of course, Grayboy is a really beautiful coming of age story about finding one's voice, but also your identity within the spaces that we operate or live in. So what advice would you give to young people who are struggling to find their place, voice, or role in the world?
I think it's important to find, I guess, two things. One, I think it's important to figure out sort of what your values are, what you stand for. When I came to the Black table, it was the first time, and I write about this, about switching lunch tables and how that was like a monumental thing in my life. It still kind of is. It was a pivotal moment, and I was then sitting around guys that clearly had a value system. I think that reasonable people can disagree on whether it was a very strong one, but they clearly had values, ideals that they had committed themselves to, loyalty and family and a hard work ethic. And I think it's important, like, I think it's worth it to like just sit down, even as a young person, and just like put words on paper, like these 5 things I stand for. And they guide sort of who I am and my behavior. And I've actually done that exercise before. And I think it just provides clarity. The other thing that I think is important is finding community. For me, it was the Black table. It was also family, but finding community that really loved me back the way I loved it. I think that's incredibly important as well.
Great. Thank you so much. So yeah, I think that's a great note for us to end on in terms of our conversation this evening. So again, thank you so much for all of your poignant insights. It's truly been a pleasure speaking with you. But now we'd like to invite our audience members to submit their questions to Cole using the Q&A function in the menu bar. So I'll go ahead and get started with our audience questions. So we do have somebody asking, it seems mothers typically have the talk with their sons. Why do you think it is mothers and not fathers? Did you discuss the talk she had with you later with your father?
That's a good question. I've never really thought about that. I mean, I can speak to it in my own case. In my own case, I was in a single parent household. So there's a very simple answer there. I write about this a little bit in the book, but my father moved out just before I got to high school, and that was before a lot of those conversations had to be had. I was much closer with my mother, and I think she felt that threat about as viscerally as one can. I also think that if I'm just actively thinking through this as I'm talking, there's a certain vulnerability that is needed to acknowledge that this thing that you created is no longer safe, is beyond your control. Like what will happen to this thing is no longer within the bounds of what you control. I think that vulnerability is a trait that is in short supply oftentimes in Black men, and we can discuss sort of the reasons for that, but as a result, I think for that reason, it probably falls upon the mothers disproportionately to step into that role.
All right, great. Thank you so much. So we do have another question. What are you doing while living in Australia? And how does being Black in Australia feel differently and the same than being Black in the US?
Yeah. So I moved to Australia in February, just before, I think I got here February 10th. And we were locked down by first week of March or something. So I moved here just before coronavirus became a thing. I came here for a job. I have since taken a leave from that job, and I now write full time for one of the major papers here. I also am working on a film here that I'm writing, and then I do quite a bit of political commentary. So they've needed an American voice through the craziness y'all have going on back home, to help try to explain things, and I do my best to help out with that. in terms of how Black is different and the same, I think that lives time in Australia has given me an appreciation for just how local so much of our prejudices are. We think of these qualities of Blackness and whiteness and the relationship between the two as being universal, but they are so not. But Australia doesn't have a real Black history in the sense of African people becoming Australian African sort of in this context. It has a very different, equally, if not worse, history of abuse with its own indigenous people. So what's interesting is when you call the phrase Black in this context often refers to Aboriginal and indigenous people. So I much of the prejudice, much of the animosity, just like the day-to-day aspersions, not being able to get a cab and like that kind of stuff just doesn't happen as much to me here. That said, they have their own, abusive history to negotiate.
Great, thank you so much. And again, I would encourage our viewers to purchase Grayboy. Again, a really beautiful book, but it's also an interesting connection because in the letter that your mother writes, she talks about what it was like to be a Black woman, but growing up in Germany, and how when she came to the United States, she kind of like felt her Blackness more acutely, and it was just kind of like different for her to experience that. So just a really great like connection. So thank you. So you mentioned this earlier, but we do have our audience members that would like to know what current or future projects are in the works for you.
Yes. So right now, I'm trying to put on my writer hat these days. So I'm doing a lot of op-eds on political topics, as I mentioned, for both the Sydney Morning Herald here, but also Blavity in the U.S. The political commentary, I think, is a thing that I will try to keep doing for a while. And then in terms of longer term stuff, I'm working on a short film right now that I'm incredibly excited about with a really talented actor here in Australia that starred in a couple of big shows in the US as well. So we're excited about that project. And then also I'm hoping that the work with Grayboy is not quite done. We're ironing out some details there, but I think there might be some future projects with that as well, which will be good. And there will be another book. Lastly, there will be another book that actually, as soon as we hang up, I'm going to talk to my editor about. So starting down that path too.
Okay, awesome. We'll be sure to get you there on time so we can have more of your great work. But again, we'll keep an eye out for your great work. Again, it's a truly beautiful book, and we just know that you have such a bright future ahead of you. So again, it's just fantastic. So thanks. So again, I'm just kind of looking at some of the questions here. When you were writing your book, did you ever consider if you would get any backlash for it? And if you did, how did you handle it?
Yeah, I think in the early years, that's probably another reason that it took me so long. I think in the early years, I thought a lot about that. I'm not an inherently very open person just by my nature. And there's a lot of details in this book that are deeply intimate and kind of my whole universe, from like people as close as my mom to like that kid that, I didn't talk to in 10th grade, like, and everyone in between all found out these very intimate details about me at the same time. So it was difficult to wrestle with that. There was also the overlay of, I'm telling other people's stories, and that there's a duty of care that comes with that. So I was concerned about that. And then just like I come from a community. It's called Chestnut Hill. It's in Philly. It's a small town within a big city. And there was certainly, I expected, going to be mixed feelings about that community. And like everyone has to deal with the reality of like eventually going home. So all of that weighed upon me, particularly in the early years. I had to get to a point where I had pushed all of that out of my mind. By I think the end of year 2, probably, like it was almost like writing into a diary. I mean, like my only concern was honesty. And I had honesty, the truth as I saw it. And I had so dissociated myself away from that. I mean, there was such cognitive dissonance that it truly, and like, I'm not just saying this, like it did not even occur to me that anyone would read this until like the release day. I mean, like well after I had the publishing contract, like I had picked a cover, like everything was, there were physical books in my hand.
Mhm.
And only then was I like, oh hell, like people are actually going to know this stuff.
Mhm.
But I think that that kind of dissonance was necessary in order to get to where we landed.
Great, thank you. Well, yeah, we're so glad that we're able to have it and that we're able to read it and really learn from it. So thank you so much. So we do have another question. Do you plan to stay in Australia or will you return to the U.S.?
I'm coming back soon. That's a quick answer. Probably we're shooting this short film, which I'm super excited about. Like I mentioned, I think we're doing that in January. The second we finish shooting, I'm on a plane. It's time to come home.
Yeah. We also have another question. Do you see yourself running for political office?
It's funny that someone says that. I thought about that at one point in recent days. I think that there's a lot of good that can be done in that realm, but hopefully I think you might be able to be more effective in other roles instead. So that's my one feeling on it. My other feeling on it is that I come from a generation that is probably the first generation that will have all of its mistakes, permanently recorded, engraved in stone, on the internet. Uh, I got to see how someone else deals with that grief before I try to walk that path, because I got as many as the next man and more. So I got to think about that too.
All right, great, thank you. So we have someone else writing. Did you have any friends growing up that were Jewish? If so, have you had any meaningful conversations about them and their experiences or being treated differently?
Yeah, I did. I didn't. So my like where I grew up in Philly did not have a sizable Jewish community. But my best friend, who I actually write about in the book, his name is Ben. And we are like, in fact, I hung up the phone with him just before getting on here. He is Jewish. I think he was the first person that exposed me to Jewish culture. And then I got to Georgetown, and like, certainly not intentionally, but it just kind of worked out like this, that like I was the black kid in a group of largely Jewish friends. And they have since exposed me even more so. We have had conversations. Interestingly, the one that I just had recently was, I write about dating in the book. And I write about the perceived importance of the community that of the black community sort of picking a black partner. And I think there's clear parallels, and I have these conversations with my Jewish friends of like pressures to pick someone from within the group, in order to perpetuate this, the lineage, the heritage that we value. I think that there's clear parallels in these two, and I think that particularly when young, we're actually negotiating it in very similar ways of like, railing against parental expectations and yet feeling real value for the heritage that we come from. So that conversation is probably on my mind only because I had it literally yesterday and many times in the past as well.
Mhm. Great, yeah, thank you. And again, the questions are just pouring in. So again, people are
I'll
just
try to be
really
I'll try to be quicker with my answers.
No, no, no,
So
no, you're
yes, let's
fine.
do
It's
it.
just like, it's really powerful to see the impact, that your words and your perspective is having on people. So again, thank you so much. We're really all enjoying this so much. So
Absolutely.
have somebody writing. How do you handle writer's block? Do you ever get writer's block while writing this book?
Yeah, I think that writer's block is like almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think that would really help. Like for instance, I had a serious hangover from the book where I just like couldn't write anything for a while. And then the first thing I wrote after the book was this piece that I wrote in the run up to the election for the Sydney Morning Herald, and I got it out in a day. And the reason I did is because like it was due in a day. So like I didn't have a choice. I think that this notion of like waiting for inspiration to strike uh, is a difficult one, and I'm not sure. I think it's a bit of a fallacy, to be honest. It's just not how I work. For instance, I do need to take in a lot of stuff. I read a lot. I listen to a lot of podcasts. I think that like that really helps me. And when I'm not doing that, I notice that I'm a bit slower to write. But there's nothing that can replace just like sitting your butt in the chair and not getting up until you have words on the page. Sometimes you just got to do it.
Mhm. Great, thank you. So were there individuals who shared their stories with you that were at first hesitant to share them and have them published?
Only because only because this was originally an essay for a class. So all of the original interviews I had, frankly, like, even though I told my friends I was going to be publishing a book, like, I don't think anybody acknowledged that that was a real possibility really until I put the cover up on Instagram and like Diddy's name was on it. And then it was like, oh hell, like like then I started getting calls of like, Cole, can I massage some of those quotes? Fortunately in the early years, I don't think anybody believed this was as real as it became. And therefore we're incredibly candid. I didn't, well, but I'm not giving them enough credit, because even after that, everybody acknowledged the value of this, if not for us, for kids like us a few years younger. And I changed a name or two, but otherwise, like, I didn't change much. Everybody stands on sort of what they said and the honesty they delivered for me.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much. So for our last question for this evening, again, we want to make sure that we can get you to your book talk on time. We want to have more of your work available.
I didn't mean to rush you. I'm happy to answer all that is given.
No, yeah, again, thank you so much. This has been a really fabulous conversation. But for our last question this evening, have you found a sense of belonging at this stage in your journey?
Yes, I can say that unequivocally. The slightly longer answer is that I think as one matures, hopefully, one, like, a lot of that stuff becomes less important. You know, you can stand on your own merit and on your own values, and understand that there is value in that, and someone else not acknowledging that value speaks only to their perception and not to your inherent value. I think that that's something that hopefully comes with maturity. I think people are like just less mean as you get older, and hopefully, you know, more embracing of your many parts. And then also hopefully, you know, I mentioned this earlier, but hopefully you find community. I've been really blessed and fortunate to have done that. You know, found people that love me the way I love them, and that's when you really find belonging, is you know, people that are many people that are similar, but also many that are dissimilar, but that embrace me in a way that I am incredibly grateful for.
Great. Well, wonderful. Thank you again so much. This has been such a fantastic conversation. Our participants
Absolutely.
really enjoyed our discussion this evening. And again, it was just a really profound experience for all of us involved. So again, we really extend our thanks for your time, and again, for your really beautiful work. So now I'd like to hand it back over to Wendy for our closing remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, Lori and Cole, for such an illuminating conversation. It was just fantastic. And I thank our audience for joining us tonight. Please know that a recording of tonight's conversation will be sent out tomorrow, as well as a link to purchase Cole's book, which I'm sure everyone is anxious to have a copy of. So we hope you will join us for the final event of the Dismantling Bias lecture series on December 2nd. We will be hosting Yashika Dutt, who will be speaking about her book, Coming Out as Dalit. So thank you again. Thank you, Cole. Best of luck. We hope we'll see you again soon.
Thank you for having me. This was fantastic.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Bye.